Okay, so I'm so sorry starting the recording a little bit late. Uh, so we've gone through the norms. So let's talk about for a moment, if you had a very resistant teen who refused to go to school, your own child, your student, or your client, what would you be hopeful for in conversation with them? And maybe I'll just stop share for a second. So just think about it for a moment. What would you be hopeful for in conversation with them?
I think I'd be, I suppose, hopeful for kind of ability for open communication, a kind of like an open conversation rather than just jump into immediately hoping to return back to school. Um, I think an open communication, I guess, would be something I'd be hopeful for.
Okay, so no expectations for outcome, just an open opportunity to express and to engage with the other person. Thank you. Thanks, Gaia. Any other thoughts? So George says that the student can find a reason to attend. Olga says, well, for the child to stop refusing and go to school finally. Okay, thank you for that. Anybody else? Okay, so I'm going to start sharing again. So what is school refusal? It's defined as a persistent or extended school absence motivated by the student who is missing more than 10% of school days. That's 19 plus days in the year. It includes consistent lateness or difficulty remaining in school for the whole day. It's stress inducing for the teen and the whole family because it's a constant battle of wills. Destructive behaviors, routines are thrown up in the air. Everybody's having a really difficult time. It generally begins between the ages of 5 and 11. And of course, it worsens in high school when young people know that they have more freedom, right? They can leave after a certain period, they can exit the building and enter the building pretty freely. So it that's when it tends to worsen. It often arises after stressful events like COVID, for example. So, just as an example, pre pandemic, students were missing on average a maximum of 5% of school days per academic year. That's approximately 10 days per year. And 22% of students in elementary and secondary, and I'm talking now globally, 22% of students in elementary and secondary now miss 15 or more days per year. And that's actually a very conservative figure. So, and most of the research that has come out of this and the way that the data has been collected is it's basically student attendance data that's coming out of schools and school boards. So escalating absences are most often motivated by avoidance. The young person is trying to avoid something that's going on at school. Sometimes it's actually external reinforcement. Like, for example, you might have a situation where you have a separated family and one parent tends to be home or working from home certain days a week. And that is the parent that they don't regularly get to see very often. So they stay home to be with the parent. Um, Sometimes it's just the need for parental attention. So they want to be noticed, and so they're going to make the choice to stay home. And sometimes it's mental health distress, and there are a variety of different forms of mental health distress. So distress and behavior, of course, increase with continued absences because, the longer you're away from school, the more the work builds up, the more alienated you feel, the less connected you feel with your peers. If you were on any teams or in any clubs or anything like that, you're no longer a participant. And so you feel the burden of all that. And some young people may internalize the problem with depression and anxiety. And of course, others externalize the problem with conduct and defiance. So, if any of you have ever had or felt a need to motivate a young person with school refusal back to school, you'll know that they're really not interested in your unsolicited advice. They don't want that. They're going to turn off to you. They're just simply not going to want to engage in that conversation. And you'll find yourself wanting to use all of your powers of persuasion, address the topic of not going to school on a regular basis. You'll want to tell them they must go, ask them why they don't want to go to school, and they'll often simply continue to resist. When schools and parents struggle, they sometimes reach out to mental health professionals who try to do just what we were talking about, right? They try to diagnose the problem. They try to get the teen back to school as soon as possible with a problem focus. They're going to ask, what's wrong? Why aren't you going to school? How can I get you back in school? Let's develop a plan. I'll pick you up tomorrow. One of the things that I've noticed over the last few years is this bribery that often the social worker or the psychologist or whoever it is that's trying to get the student back in school says, we're going to stop by Tim Hortons and we're going to get you a coffee and a donut or something like that to try to bribe the student into going. And of course, none of this really works. Young people don't want to talk. It's hard when there's that stigma attached. They're viewed as different. They're viewed as a disappointment, problematic. They're ashamed. Even teachers sometimes involuntarily in classrooms will say things like, oh, yeah, Arnold, yeah, he's not here again. And they won't even realize what they're saying. And so, often this type of situation is beyond the young person's control. So, of course, the young person just simply continues to resist. They're not going to want to engage in any of that. Yet SFBT views resistance as a form of communication. Resistance is merely a pattern of behavior to be understood and addressed through thoughtful questioning and collaboration. What do you make of this statement by Steve DeShazer? Resistance is merely a pattern of behavior to be understood and addressed through thoughtful questioning and collaboration. Just share what's ever on your mind. If you're having any thoughts about it, maybe you agree with it, maybe you don't agree with it.
I would say, Vicky, that I agree with that. I feel like resistance, or earlier Hassan was talking about pracademic research, like what is it that makes us angry? And that can inform what research questions we ask. So in the same way, what is it that the child is refusing? And really understanding that can help us understand maybe there are some challenges that they are legitimate for them. Like I was just mentioning, I know it's a different topic, but some people don't like the method that schools use to teach, and they prefer homeschooling or eclectic schooling. So that could also be something that the student is bringing to the table that we can actually just try to understand more.
Yes, yeah. I like what you're saying about the student bringing it to the table. Student brings it to the table, and we try to understand what it is that they're bringing to that conversation. Thanks, Shema. Is anybody having any other thoughts about this? That resistance is just merely a pattern of behavior, and that we shouldn't really get bogged down in the actual behavior itself, but that we should address it differently, that we should address it collaboratively, questioning, open conversation, that we should try to understand the other person.
Anne-Marie, I don't think we can hear you. I think I can see you're trying to speak, but I don't think we can hear you for some reason. I'm just going to use the moment to just, because there's a few things that come in the chat as well.
Can you still not hear me?
No, we can hear you, Vicky. It's just Anne-Marie, I think, is trying to speak.
Oh, Anne-Marie, we can't hear you.
Maybe you can hear me now.
Oh, yes,
yeah, we got you now.
Yes, thank you.
That was so nice. I agree with this. I think for me, and what is useful about it is that it invites me to think about that clients have good reasons for whatever they are doing. And that is why this questioning and collaboration just invites me into further curiosity about what are they good reasons. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Yes, they have a very good reason for what they're doing. Absolutely. Okay.
Got,
Well,
I was
yeah.
going to say we got a few comments in the chat just saying, I think
Oh, do you want
resistance
to
is a
read
way
them?
of telling. I can read them. Yeah, no worries. So I think resistance is a way of telling us we're asking the wrong questions. People are resistant when they do not want to feel heard. As Steve Deshager said, there's no such thing as a resistant client, only an inflexible therapist. So the statement gets away from judgment, taking us away from right and wrong, allowing us to listen, select, and build forward. And then when we ask young people what they want, they're much more likely to engage when we see them as an expert for themselves.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, and I do believe that young people are experts for themselves. They may not know, they may not understand yet. They may need to kind of flesh that out, but they are experts for themselves. So we can't stop school refusal, clearly, by engaging in a conversation about the problem. As solution-focused enthusiasts, we know that. We need to view the young person as having their own goals, their values, their aspirations, and priorities. We need to understand that there's a good reason why they're choosing not to go to school. And in some way, they're helping themselves to manage their current life situation. It may not look like they're managing, but they're actually doing things to help themselves manage their own distress. And view their situation as a form of self-protection and resilience in coping through crisis. If they're home and they're home for extended periods of time and they are in fact self-protecting from some form of crisis or stress or anxiety that is being provoked at school, then maybe actually staying at home for now is a pretty good idea, right? So we want to set all judgments aside. Now, Insoo Kimberg has this beautiful quote. She says, whether we admit it or not, our own assumptions spill over into our interactions. And I love the way she says, she had this marvelous way of saying things. And the way she said, in a subtle and not so subtle manner, this awareness is crucial when working with adolescents who may be wary of authority figures. If you have children or if you have people that are very close to you, you will know that they know how you communicate. They know how you communicate non-verbally or verbally. Students know this about their teachers as well. Even when we're not saying things, they know what we're saying. And so I think this is the subtlety and the non-subtlety that Insoo is referring to. We need to prioritize an expression of unconditional mattering and belonging that supports safety and inclusion. So nobody should be left out, right? Everybody matters. It doesn't matter what they're thinking. It doesn't matter what they're feeling. It doesn't matter what their values are, what their thoughts are. Everybody matters, not because of what they do or the choices or decisions that they make, but simply because they live on this planet and they're human beings on this planet, and they deserve to be recognized. We need to be mindfully present to notice and celebrate all of these attributes in the young person. And what this does is it promotes a self-concept so that even when they're going through a difficult time, they know that they matter. And that will help them through that difficult time. So I just wanted to make a distinction here between the deficit starting point in conversation and the strength-based starting point in conversation. And it really sort of delineates what you think of the young person before entering into the conversation has a huge impact. Now, I did not create this. It was beautifully and simply created by Jim Knight, who is an expert in communication and has written several books in coaching, instructional coaching. And so he says, So I've adapted this to teens essentially. And he says, okay, you've got this deficit starting point, which sometimes we experience before we enter into the conversation with a teen, which is where we see the team as problematic, as struggling. We don't necessarily think that anything good is going to come out of this conversation. We might have emotional feelings about the teen even before entering into the conversation, especially if we have a personal relationship with them. And then you have the strength-based starting point, which what it does is it manages the narrative even before you enter into the conversation. And that's where we stop, we check our bias, right? We ask ourselves, are we being judgmental? Can we clear our minds and selves of that? We remind ourselves that these young people have a good reason for what they're doing. And that helps us to generate a conversation that starts in a positive relation space. It's what I call a positive relation space. To me, the idea of relation space is an imagery that we use to describe the solution-focused mindset that we bring ourselves to a conversation with. Okay, and so when we're able to set that stage before we enter the conversation, we can generate that positive conversation in that positive space. And the teen leaves feeling hopeful, valued, and valuable, and so do we. So align with and hear the young person. So, I like to talk about hearing in conversation more than listening, because sometimes we're listening, but we're not fully hearing what the young person has to say. And this is because as adults, we don't often think as young people as really having meaningful adult-like things to say. We think of them as children. But young people are very bright, very insightful, very reflective. And we want to hear them because they inform the narrative. They inform the conversation, and often they change the course of conversation for the better. And they give us an opportunity to learn about them and their world view. So we can ask them, what do you think? What are you interested in? How do you feel? We also try to speak their language, right? Now, young people, there's always new language that we need to be in the know about, and I'm not always in the know about. But if, for example, if a young person wants to describe something as really good, as being really dope, then I might want to use that in conversation and help them to feel that we can be aligned, right? So that's a really important piece of it. Invite them to share their perspective, even if it challenges our values, right? I might not agree with the teen. I might think they're making poor decisions. I might think what they're saying is a little problematic, but that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what I think, because this is about what they think. It's about their values, their perspective. And young people, they're in transit. They're learning about themselves, they're learning about the world, and they need to be able to actively engage and explore. That's what researchers do. Researchers are given the opportunity, they're even given money, right? To explore, to get it right, to get it wrong, to try things out, right? And that's what we want our young people to do, so they can really develop a sense of self and a sense of agency. So we want to validate them. It's okay to be feeling this way. There must be a good reason for you to be feeling this way. So let's stop for a moment and talk about this quote by Hae-Sun Moon, who is the author of the Dialogic Quadrant and Coaching A to Z. Understand that teen behaviors or complaints are an expression of needing to be heard. Who would like to just reflect on that for a moment with us?
I think she makes a lot of sense when she talks about that. And I think I think it's an indication to us that when we are thinking, how do I reach this student? How do I reach this young person? The most important thing is to just sit back and be very curious and just think, I need to get to know you. I'd love to know your thoughts about this. In regard to school refusal, Vicky, I often, when I've worked with people that have been bothered by school refusal, I often ask them a miracle question. Suppose you woke up tomorrow morning and you thought, I don't mind going today. What would you
Yes.
be looking forward to? What would, when you walked in the building, what would you be feeling? What would you be thinking? What would you be experiencing that would tell you it's okay to go just today?
Yes.
And that seems to be able to help us find a way in to understand, because anything else we suggest is our idea and it needs to always be theirs. And we can work with that if we just, like you're saying, hear them. So
Thank you, Linda. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
sure.
Would anybody else like to comment on that statement by Hassan?
I guess I jump in, I guess,
Yeah.
saying, yeah,
Yeah.
student behaviours, complaints being expressed and needing to be heard. I think complaining teenagers can be very just immediately putting a box into a label of a complaining teenager. You know, it's almost made fun of. And actually, yeah, it's just sometimes liberating to be escaping that box, because I think it can be quite often just used as a way to demean and create distance, I suppose. So I don't know where I'm going with this thought, but I guess, yeah, that I just totally agree with it. And it's good to think of it in this way to kind of get away from that labeling place.
Yes. And we definitely get caught up in these narratives, don't we? We get caught up in these stories that we tell ourselves of these teens sometimes, that somehow, we've got the well-behaving kids at school who are achieving, who are doing all the things they're supposed to be doing. And then we've got those teens that are sort of, they're exiting, they're not there, they're not behaving, they're not following the norm. And we tell ourselves those stories about them and they stick. And what happens is that often they're very infectious, these stories, and the teens themselves start to take them on as their own narrative and their own personal identity, and they act on that. So yes, thank you, absolutely. So sometimes behavior is a cry for help. Young people will behave in ways that work for them. Every behavior we know has a purpose or a logic that needs to be respected. Sometimes this surfaces as behavior against the norm, like shutting down or acting out or breaking rules. They know it's against the norm and they know we're watching. On some level, though, they want us to help them, but they don't really know what to ask for. They don't really necessarily know what they need. So one of the things we really want to do is to destigmatize distress. And Susan David, who wrote Emotional Agility, she says we need to send spoken and unspoken messages that normalize distress in mental health. We're too busy in society setting up that stigma, making people feel uncomfortable about being distressed, sending unspoken messages that say, hey, guess what? It's not okay. You have to feel good. You have to be healthy. You have to make sure you get to school every day. Make sure you get to work every day. You have to be productive and on and on and on. And so that message, the implication of that message is that it's not okay to feel distress and to perhaps need a hiatus or to need to step back or to need to ask for help. Right? Sometimes, I'll be speaking to a friend of mine and I'll say, well, how are you doing? And they'll say, oh, I'm fine now, but I wasn't feeling well a couple of weeks ago. I was going through this and that. And I said, why didn't you tell me? I would have loved to talk with you about it. Right? And they say, well, I was trying to just handle it myself, which is all really well and good. But that is one of the messages that society sends out, is that we kind of have to handle it ourselves and, stiff upper lip type of idea and move on. So we want to normalize distress, make it okay, to give it the significance it deserves, to respect mental health in all its forms. Today we're feeling mentally healthy, maybe tomorrow we're not, and that's all right. And when we normalize distress, it reduces stress, anxiety, depression, and gives hope. That in itself, the normalizing of distress in itself, can get a young person back to school because it almost immediately motivates healing. So we want to exercise flexibility, patience, and curiosity. Instead of trying to get the teen to open up or to change, adjust to how the teen prefers to communicate. Maybe we want to use humor, maybe we want to use stories, drawing, walking, whatever works. I was dealing with some young people the other day, and I was asking them to draw a framework for me of what they wanted. And one boy just sat there drawing what looked like code. And I asked him if it was actual code. And he said, no, but it's what I imagine actual code might look like. And this was what he was developing and creating. And I just thought that was so wonderful because he was expressing himself in a way that meant something to him. So hear what they're saying with curiosity. We want to learn about them. We want to know about them. And we want to celebrate small signs of progress. When a teen is struggling with getting back to school, even getting out of bed is something to celebrate. To say, I noticed that you got out of bed this morning, right? Putting the phone out of the room at night. Right? They know they can't sleep. They know that it's a real struggle. But on this night, they managed to put their phone outside of the room. Getting on the bus, staying in school for one more period. They managed to get to school in the morning. They've been leaving school after period 1, but today they stayed until after period 2. That's a success. Following through with one assignment. Never mind that they've got 20 to complete, but they followed through with one. And to understand, of course, and we know about the benefit of small steps and small signs in solution focus, and that there are no overnight successes. We want to shift from that perceived resistance to listening for the teen's own voice. I often say that it's one thing to give a person voice. Giving a person voice is a wonderful thing, and we talk a lot about that. But how are we giving them voice, right? Because if we're saying to them, what is the problem or what's going on or what's wrong, then we're giving them the type of voice that is problem focused. And that is going to enter into a conversation that just spirals downward, that has no hope for solution, right? And we can talk for an hour about the problem and never get anywhere. But a future-oriented conversation, for example, seeks to understand what the young person wants for themselves in the moment or in the short or long term, right? So talking about what they want, giving them hope, even during the current struggle. We don't have to wait for them to be having a good day to have this type of conversation. Even in the current struggle, we could have it. It pulls the mindset out of that place of darkness, of being stuck in the problem. Talking about small successes is manageable, right? If I know that there is one small thing that I can do to bring hope to my day, that's a manageable thing. It doesn't feel like that huge mountain that I need to climb to turn my life around so I can become that great student, right? How do they envision working toward an immediate or best hope? What is their vision? What is their best hope, not our best hope? And how can we help them to appreciate noticing the small signs toward progress? So rather than to say, how can we get you to going back to school? We want to ask, what can be better for you? What about when things are just 10% better? What will that look like? And that's a variation on a scaling question, as we know. What will that look like? When you feel that things are just as you want them to be, what will you notice? And that's a variation on the miracle question that Linda was talking about, right? What is better today? How do you know? So we're instilling a sense of agency, right? I loved what Insu had a way with words that I just loved and can't stop reading and rereading the way that she explains things. And she said, What do you think you're already willing to do? Not what do you think you're already doing, which is also a very good question, but what do you think you're already willing to do to start moving in that direction? What is your willingness, right? I do believe that anybody can do anything if they are willing. It's that willingness that is the motivator. What is a small thing you think you may need today? How do you think that will help? So when we talk about future orientation, we're not just talking about the future. We're talking about today, what's happening now. And we're not just talking about what is happening that will be in the absence of the problem. We're talking about what can happen even during the problem. And what is a small step you can take today to help yourself to feel better? And then, of course, we have the exception finding questions that we know so well. What is the teen already doing that works? So the teen does not or has not always refused to go to school. We know that. We know that when teens are experiencing problems or behaviors or whatever, this does not happen 24 hours a day, and it has not happened does not happen 7 days a week, and it has not happened forever. So what coping strategies were being used when the teen was going to school, or even now as the teen refuses to go to school, right? It's possible that now, even as the teen refuses to go to school, they know they're missing physics class, so they're tuning into a physics podcast every once in a while. It's possible that they're doing that, right? It's possible that even though they're at home, they're actually stopping to make themselves a nice meal for lunch. Could be happening. It's a good thing, right? Ask the teen to reflect on these so that they can notice their competence and resilience. When they reflect on their abilities to cope, they'll be able to use them again to support their self-efficacy, even in other contexts, right? Even when things are going better, or even just in other experiences in their lives. So rather than to say, you've really been shutting down, what's wrong? You can ask, when was the last time you were able to be at school? What worked for you then? How was it better? How did you manage? And how do you know? How did you manage, right? The coping questions. So important that we have the ability to manage and cope through just about anything. What part of school, and you know, I mean, here's another exception-oriented question, right? Is that, like, again, school is a problem. The child is focusing on the problem. But what part of the problem is even a little okay? What part of school is even a little okay? How do you know? What part of being at home is helping? How's it helping? How are you managing to cope this very moment, even just in having this conversation with me? What is helpful for you and what else? So let's stop for a moment and talk about, how do you think the teen will respond to future-oriented and exception-finding conversations? And remember, these are conversations. They're not, I mean, they can be therapeutic, right? It can be a conversation that happens in therapy, but it can be a conversation that happens between teacher and child, between parent and child, between guidance counselor and child. But, you know, it doesn't have to be, it can be a coaching conversation, right? So how do you think that the future orientation and the exception finding will be helpful or hopeful for them? Just take a moment to think about that. And Gaia, I haven't asked if there was anything in the chat.
I've not seen anything come up at the moment.
Okay.
I got a bit of a, it's probably not responding to this, but I've got a bit of a question actually on this one.
Yeah.
Because I could just think of a circumstance where I've tried to use the sort of exception finding kind of conversation and looking towards the future in the idea of being sort of hopeful and that kind of thing. But it's been sort of almost batted back at me with an impossible future, essentially to do with bereavement, for example, was the situation that I was in, was the looking to the future and exceptions in times that I was going to school, this person was around, for example. And I just wonder, how might you look to approach that in that circumstance?
So can you just clarify the example in the sense that, so the young person is going through bereavement.
Yes, yeah. So
Okay.
the young person.
And what was the question that you asked them?
I think it was around noticing exceptions. So it was what noticing difference actually, and what was different around this time when you were going to school, that was allowing you to go to school, or something along those lines, I believe. And it was that mum was still around, for example.
Okay, and they came back and said to you, what did they say to you?
Mum's here, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Nothing. So, I mean, there are a few ways of addressing that, right? Like, firstly, with young people who refuse to talk, there are a few things to consider, right? One is that we need to know when to give them space, right? They're not always going to want to talk, and we need to respect that, right? That's the first thing. The other thing is to motivate talking when we think that they might be amenable to it. We can address using the hypotheticals, using hypothetical language with them, right? So, a great way for a teen to push us away is to say, I don't know. I don't know, which is another way of saying, leave me alone, right? And they're going to do that. They're going to do that. So what we could say, for example, by using hypothetical language, we can say, well, what if you knew? Suppose you knew, right? Suppose you understood. Suppose you were thinking differently. Suppose you were feeling differently, right? So this hypothetical language, it re-engages the I don't know. And you can ask it in a few different ways so that even if they say I don't know 2 or 3 times, on the fourth time they realize that you're not really going to accept the I don't know, because you're just going to come back with another hypothetical question. And so they now have to. And what they also realize with hypothetical questions is that they're kind of brilliant, aren't they? Because there's no right answer. They don't have to be accountable for saying, well, this is what I'm going to do, or this is what I think, or this is what I hope. They can just kind of muse with you. And so that's the brilliance of the hypothetical question. Does that kind of help a little bit?
Yeah, no, it does.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes me think about going to other tools, and
Okay.
hypothetical, yeah, it could be really useful in that situation.
Does anybody else have any responses to Gaia in terms of dealing with that person who, doesn't like the question and really doesn't want to talk?
I like to tell them I don't know either.
Yeah.
And that, it may be that, we might need to stop our time today. And I'd send them off with a little note saying, watch for anything over the next day or so that tells you that's okay. And then I'll call you back and we'll talk about it in a couple of days.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. I
Thank
like
you.
the little I like the little note
Yeah.
and the bit of a thinking homework assignment. I love that.
Can I jump in, please?
Yes, please do.
Okay. If it depends on whether the child is sent to me or the child comes on their own. If the child is sent to me, then they are a hostile witness, just like in court.
Right.
So I'm going to treat them like a hostile witness, and I'm going to ask them a question. If they say they don't know, I'll go along with that. And I would tell them, look, you have been sent to me. We both have to be here for the next half hour or whatever. So if you want to stay in silence with me, it's fine. And generally, when I've done this, they begin to see somebody who gets them. And then they're more open to talking. I would talk about something else. We're not going to talk about why they've been sent. We can talk about other things. It may mean that it's important if they want to come and see you again after that. And maybe we have to be patient. But using SFBT, I found that when they say, if you ask them a question, say like a medical question, most people say, I don't know, because they just bowled over, right, with a question like that. Even when you ask them what are your best hopes from talking to me, they always ask you to please repeat the question, because they're all prepared to talk about their problem. And we take such a different view in SFBT. So if they are reluctant to talk, I would go along with that. It doesn't matter. We want to know what's happening inside them. Why are they hurting? What is hurting about them? I know we don't talk about the problem, but when they talk about their problem, we say, and what enabled you? Where did you get the strength to overcome this? So we use that as a stepping stone, not as the thing. Okay.
Thank you so much, Clifford. Thank you very much for that. Any additional comments? That was a great question, Gaia. It really got us thinking. Thank you. So just, I didn't want to walk away from this session making it look like we have conversations with teens and that changes everything for them. Because working with young people, it's that idea of the community needs to work together. There needs to be a multidisciplinary approach. I have a lot of respect for Dr. Cynthia Franklin's work, where she has her, if you get a chance to look at her book, Solution Focused Brief Therapy in Alternative Schools, and she talks of some of these at-risk young people. And, she has developed a comprehensive and evidence-based framework. And essentially, what she's saying is, look, we need to be there. We need to work together, home and school, community. We need to bring everybody together, use the solution-focused philosophy, amplify students' strengths, but we have to be able to collaborate, and we have to do it consistently, and we have to stick with it. So this idea of sustainability and long-term success. And of course, really, she puts a lot of energy into helping students with that future orientation through achievable goals and action plans. So I just wanted to make sure that I said that we can't just walk away from these conversations and say, okay, we had a really good conversation with a teen and everything is going to be okay now. We have to be there for them, to support them and help them, and to work together. And in my experience, the most valuable connection is the connection between home and school. Parents communicating with the school, developing relationships with key partners in the school, and vice versa. It's got to be an ongoing process. And I just want to say some last words about fresh starts. I really believe in fresh starts. I believe that when we give people the chance to start over fresh every single day. So imagine if you're a young person who is not attending school and you've really been struggling and you feel terrible at the end of the day, and it's been impacting your ability to sleep and your ability to relax, and you're just becoming more and more anxious. But if you know that tomorrow you can start fresh, you won't be judged. Nobody's going to say you're behaving poorly. Everybody's going to be looking at the very best in you, and they're going to be giving you every opportunity, every day, no matter how bad today was. You will sleep better, you will feel better, you will be less anxious, and you'll try something else tomorrow. You'll try something different tomorrow with hope. So I just really believe in the concept of fresh starts. I believe everybody should be doing it everywhere, whether it's at school or in family or in organizations or with all of your relationships. So before we close up our conversation today, here's an opportunity for you to share whatever you like, and just questions, comments, whatever comes forth.
Sorry, I struggled to find the unmute button.
Is there anything in
I'm not
the
seeing
chat,
anything in the
Gaia?
chat. No, it's just a lot of great session. Thank you very much. Appreciate you.
Okay. All right. So listen, everyone, I'm not going to keep you then. Maybe you can get yourself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee before going to the next session. And again, I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank SF 2425 and the organizing team for putting together this amazing conference and this amazing opportunity to connect together as a global solution-focused community. And it's my honor and pleasure to be here and to have presented for you today. So thank you and have a great day. And I hope to catch up with some of you in other sessions.